Hi there, my friends. Today I thought I'm going to do something different. I spent quite a few years peddling home study courses to people who didn't have their high school finished. I'm a good one to talk, but anyway, that's what I did. And they were going to take a GED course and then get their high school diploma and then eventually end up with a decent job. So I sent out letters telling people that I would send them a free booklet and explain the details, made it attractive, and sent out thousands of those letters. I had some girl actually do this for me. She just typed them and sent them out. In those days, that's what you could do. And when I got returns, maybe 2 or 3 out of 100, that was about the average return, they came from all over the province of Manitoba, where I was living at the time, and also from northern Ontario and part of Saskatchewan. That's a big territory. I had a diesel car at the time. This was back in the 50s, and diesel was something unheard of, and you could actually fill up with furnace fuel and get away with it. So fuel was virtually totally cost you almost nothing. And I started out with my wife accompanying me on some of these trips, and I particularly remember the one in Ontario. We had so much fun doing this. We went out on those leads, and of course the leads were very misleading purposely. I was the booklet. There was no booklet. And my idea was to try to sell them a course. Now the best terms, the lowest terms I could get was $6 down and $6 a month. Now compare that to $60 down and $60 a month today. That's about the same as far as the value of the money is concerned. Anyway, we got some leads, and one day we were in northwestern Ontario, and we had a lead that looked kind of bad. The letter was written very poorly. Said something like, "I don't need no education," and "Who are you guys to tell me anything," etc., etc. And we were in a diner, and I had just asked casually, and this was a tiny little town in northwest Ontario. I said to the girl in the diner, "Do you know a guy by the name of John or Jack Barker?" "Oh," she said, "you mean the Mr. Barker?" I said, "I don't know about the Mr. Barker, but he's as far as I know, he's a carpenter's apprentice, or he's a laborer." "Well," she said, "the one that you have listed at your address, that's the one, that's Mr. Barker. You see that big house over there?" And she pointed to a house under construction, 2-story with an elevator, and I mean unbelievable, huge garage and whatnot. She said, "That's Mr. Barker." I said, "You're kidding." "No," she said, "he found a copper mine, and the guy is filthy rich. But he's a nice guy. He leaves the money in town, so he invests everything in this town." I said, "And that huge garage, what kind of car does he drive?" "Oh, he can't drive. He doesn't have a car. He's riding a bicycle." I said, "What is he building this for?" "Well, it appears that he must have done that for his son or somebody else." Well, that was one of those interesting stories. We got to meet Mr. Barker. Of course, there was no chance to sell him a course. But many years later, about 5-6 years later, I saw the same guy that was on a bicycle before in a work suit, in a business suit with all types of top executives running around, and he was given the orders, and there was no misunderstanding that. So the guy had really risen from rags to riches. That was an interesting story. Well, we had so much fun doing this, and then when we had our first child arrive, and my wife had to stay home, I continued doing this, and I was foolish enough to do this for another 6 years. Not a very wise decision, but we made good money, or I made good money in this deal, even though it may not sound like much. But you know, when my salary or my pay at the end of the month, end of the year, was $15,000, that's about $150,000 today. That wasn't bad. I had expenses, mind you, but that was all. But I had a lot of traveling to do. And then I can tell you some of the other stories. Second one was in Churchill. Churchill in Manitoba is way out in the sticks. I mean, you have to use a train, and it's a freight train that has a a couple of passenger cars attached to it at that time, and one of the cars was a dance car. It was absolutely for dancing only, and it had a bar, and it had a jukebox, and it was used in order to stop on the Indian reservations, and the Indians would come in when they got paid. They got paid once a month with federal money, and then they would drink, and they would dance, and they would have a hell of a time, but we would spend about an hour there, or 2 hours, and then we would go on to the next one, until we finally arrived in Churchill. Now, Churchill is the home of the polar bear, and they were rummaging through the garbage outside. It is a really desolate place, but I did make some sales in Churchill, just to tell you how awkward it was to get there from a town called the Pas in Manitoba by train to Churchill. It was a day's trip because of all these stops, but it was interesting. Another one of the trips I can tell you about is Snow Lake. Snow Lake, that is something I had found out for the company. The company was in Chicago. American School was the name of it. And I had become one of their top salesmen. And the reason was that I had found a source of money where people could make a lot of money, but they couldn't spend it anywhere. And if you knew when the paydays were coming up, and you got into this place, as awkward as it was, you could really clean up. I mean, I went into a bunkhouse, but the way I had to go in there is I had to go in by amphibious plane. Now, I didn't fly at the time. I couldn't fly myself, so I had to rent a plane and a pilot. So we took off in Flin Flon, another big town in Manitoba, and flew to Snow Lake. In Snow Lake, he landed on the lake. In the meantime, in between, there was another lake where he went down in order to leave some supplies for trappers that were out in that area. And when he came back in the middle of the lake, the engine wouldn't kick over. And this idiot asked me to get on the pontoons. Now imagine putting my legs on the two pontoons and hitting the propeller with my hand and turning it. I was not going to do this. He said I should do this, no problem. I said, what if I fall into the damn running propeller? It's crazy. And he called me all kinds of names and chickens and whatnot, and I said, well, I'll tell you what, why don't you let me handle the control and you go out and do it? But he wasn't going to do that either. So he fiddled around with the engine. Eventually it kicked over and everything was fine, and we got up in the air and we got to Snow Lake. When I got to Snow Lake, I told him, you wait on the lake, on your plane, do whatever you have to do, and he went fishing. And I do my job. I go to the bunkhouse, and I worked around the clock from night shift, day shift. Whenever they came back, there was a little light hanging off the ceiling. There was a table. I was sitting at the table. I was bringing the boys there one at a time. They were so anxious to get rid of their money. There was nothing else they could spend it on, and this was a chance for them to get their education finished, and it was a gold mine, it really was. So when I got home, I took all the money out and threw it on the floor, and we said we were playing with mud. It was a lot of fun. So that was the story about Snow Lake, and I did that many times. And then one time I went to, this was funny, I went into a cabin, and it was sort of a log cabin that the Indians were living in. And it was in the evening, snow was falling, and I went to this cabin. I knocked on the door. It was about 9 o'clock at night, and I wanted to do one more sale. And nobody answered. So I just opened the door and went in, and it was a dirt floor. There was a bed with no mattress, but just a blanket on top of it, a large bed, and nothing else. But when I went back out again, I saw there were tracks in the snow of two people leading around the house. So I followed the tracks, and sure enough, there on the side of the house with their backs against the wall were the mother and son, each one sitting on a pail doing their business. So that was their outhouse. And at that time I didn't have any shame, so I just stood in front of them. I introduced myself, and while they were crapping, I was telling them what I was doing, and that I had the greatest opportunity in the world for them, and wouldn't they love to do this, or he, the boy. And sure enough, they finished their business. We went inside, and I signed him up, and I think he's kept up his payments. So it was a good deal. But it was kind of funny to see those two shadows there in the snow sitting out against the log cabin. It was really great. That was the kind of life that I really enjoyed. And then I had another incident, and this was in Minot, North Dakota. I got transferred, finally managed to get to the States, and ended up in Minnesota. And I had a big territory of North Dakota, part of Minnesota, and part of Wisconsin, which is almost equivalent to the size of the territory I had in Canada. And this one day I go to Minot, and the way I used to do this was a nice summer day. In order to not get turned down at the door, to make it as casual as possible, I took off my jacket, I put my contract in the back pocket, and always asked for a first name. And this particular one was Mary something or other. And so I came to the door, I knocked on the door, and a woman answers the door. She was a black woman, very well endowed, with a tremendously low-cut gown. And she smiled at me and said, "Honey, what can I do for you?" And I said, "Is Mary in?" And she said, "Honey, Mary ain't in, but won't I do?" Then I realized I had run into a house of prostitution. I said politely, "No, I'm afraid you won't. It has to be Mary." And she said, "Oh, you're steady." And I said, "No, I'm not steady, but I need to see her." Well, Mary is busy. And then I went into a diner, I had a cup of coffee, and I went back to Mary. And she was a nice girl. She was a black girl, too. And she really was anxious to get her education taken care of. So I did talk to her for quite a while. And when I was all done, she suggested that I take out the fee in business. And it was very difficult to talk my way out of this one, because I didn't want to insult her on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's very easy for me to tell her that, look, I have to make a living too, and I can't spend my money this way. So anyway, I thought you might get a chuckle out of some of these little episodes. I will close for now and just let you have a short one for a change. So, end of the story.